Great, thank you, Thomas. Thank you, Misha, for the invitation, and thank all of you for coming here. As Thomas said, I'm going to present a specific case of how familiarity can be used and is used as a tool of populism in the case of Finland. And particularly, I'm going to talk about Suvivirsi, or the summer hymn, and how it has been taken up as a tool for specifically nationalist populism. I'm going to start off by saying what I mean when I talk about populism, and what I mean when I talk about populism in action, and what I mean when I talk about emotional familiarity as a tool of populism. Then I'm going to present the actual summer hymn. Also, I'm going to play you a video clip of some students singing it. I presented this once, and we actually sung it because it was in Finland and everybody knew the song, so we could demonstrate that by singing it together. But I'm not going to do that by myself. Then I'm going to present the debate. Why is it debated, and how justification and familiarity are used in that debate. So let's kick off with populism, the buzzword of the last couple of years. As many of us know, there are many ways of understanding populism, also in the literature, in political science and sociology, on populism. Some people have defined populism as a type of movement. Very many influential writers defined it as a type of ideology. But also influential writers define populism as a logic, a discursive logic specifically, or a discursive frame, depending on kind of which scholarly tradition they hail from. More recently, it has been defined as a political practice or a style, which kind of has connotations of superficiality, or a repertoire, to use a term from political sociology of the past few decades. Or it could be defined as a cultural toolkit or a political toolkit, to also use another common term from political sociology. What these kind of different views tend to have in common, of course they have very different emphases, but they do tend to view populism as politics that is based on a distinction between the people and the elite. The people are given positive connotation, the people are viewed as good, whereas the elite are viewed in a negative light. Some of the qualifications that often go with this distinction between the people and the elite in populism is that the people are often defined as the common people in a positive sense. They are defined as something real and authentic, perhaps natural, honest, maybe everyday and simple in a good way. Whereas the elite is defined as a kind of a diametric opposite to the real and authentic and honest people, as people who are corrupt, bureaucratic, and specifically technocratic. The elite, it is claimed, are distant from common sense and the worries of the everyday worries of the common people and their everyday experiences, and by extension also the will of the people. So the political situation is claimed to be anti-democratic, whereas the power should be returned to the hands of the people to restore democracy. And it is claimed that the elite tells us, or the people, what to do, how to think, how to live. These are some of the central claims that are often made in populism. And I think that despite which kind of theoretical tradition you hail from, many would agree with these. Perhaps not all, but we can discuss that a bit later. What I think needs to be noted is that populism, I think, should not be thought of inherently as nativist or radical right, or maybe even right-wing. It has been claimed that the people of populism can be defined quite flexibly. It can be defined in terms of nation by populists, but it has been claimed that, for example, in the Latin American left-wing tradition of populism, the people are more often defined in terms of class, in terms of working class, oppressed by the economic elites. And the important thing to note, of course, is that depending on how the populist defines the people, they will define the elite in the same terms, as opposed to the interests of the people. This much is clear. We could argue that very, very broadly, historically, there might be 3 waves of populism. Someone might say 4 or 5 or 6. You may disagree, and I will criticize this as well, but perhaps we should start with the Narodniki in the late 19th century Russia and the People's Party in broadly similar time frame in the rural USA, as rural movements that opposed urbanization, modernization, and what Michael Kazin calls in his history of the People's Party, the money power, which of course was a term also used by the People's Party. So these parties were really not right-wing, to separate them from the contemporary use of the word populism. Calling them left-wing might have also some problems, but they did espouse many economic and social ideas about economic equality that could be called left-wing, but they did combine those with rural conservative values. And the kind of core, or one idea that Kazin points out that's really important in the history of populism as a movement, was that already the People's Party had a very strong discourse of the producer ethic. The idea that society should value those who make things. So basically the working class, also people working on farms, people working in factories, as opposed to, let's say, stock market capitalists who don't make real things. And this is something that is, of course, very much echoed in present-day Trumpism, for example. And the interesting thing is that the Finnish Rural Party in Finland, much later, in the late 1950s, up until the 1990s, espoused a very, very similar ideology in many ways to the People's Party in rural USA in the late 19th century. Of course, Finland at that time was also going through a transformation of moving from the countryside to the cities, and a period of industrialization as well. What we could call, perhaps, the second wave is perhaps the most commonly these days, or the parties that are most commonly these days called populist. The European right-wing populist parties since the 1990s on. So the typical examples would be the Front National in France, the Austrian Freedom Party. I would classify the True Finns, which is the successor of the Finnish Rural Party, in this category. And I would consider broadly the AFD in this category as well. But some people have claimed that there is a new wave of left-wing populism as a kind of reaction to that, where we would classify parties such as Syriza in Greece, Podemos in Spain, perhaps Bernie Sanders' campaign in the US, and Corbyn's Labour leadership in the UK. That's one way of looking at sort of different movements and parties that have used populism. But there are some problems with the concept of ideology, of populism as an ideology. Namely, there are so many so-called populists, it's quite hard to see what's the ideology connecting them. If we look at the People's Party and the Narodniks, as I said, and George Wallace's campaign in the 1960s, we look at Latin American instances of populism like Chavez and Peronism, then we look at right-wing populist politicians such as Berlusconi, Thaksin Shinawatra in Thailand has been called a populist. Timo Soini, Jussi Halla-aho, Finnish populist, but very, very different populists. Is the Tea Party movement populist movement? Are Sanders and Corbyn left-wing populists? Are the pirate parties populists, for example? What is the connecting ideology here? And how much does the term populism used tell us about the ideology of these movements? And there's this big debate in populism studies on whether we should look at kind of the lowest common denominator or look at a minimal definition of populism, or should we try and describe the party family of populist parties as in a way that's as nuanced as possible. And another big debate in populism studies is, because most of the research concentrates on right-wing populism, because that's obviously the big thing in the past decade or so. It's a big debate on whether populism or nationalism is central in the ideology of right-wing populism. What is the primary? Is it populism that is nationalism, or nationalism that uses populism? And it's pretty difficult to measure the importance of a certain concept or an ideology in actual political action. So these are some of the problems we run into when talking about populism as an ideology. One more is, if we think of ideology as an internalized system of values, something that we learn from other political actors or society that affects our action. It makes us act in a certain way in politics after we have internalized those values. How do we study that? How do we separate something that is kind of learned from strategic action? You might ask, is someone actually a populist? Does he or she believe in populist ideals, or are they just acting strategically to maximize their votes? We don't necessarily have to go to that if we study populism in action empirically. For example, studying populism as a cultural toolkit, as Anne Swidler wrote. So looking at it as a shared set of practices that are used not only to do politics, but also make sense of the world. Political action that presents politics as a battle of the people versus the elite. So it's a matter of being more or less populist, or actually doing more or less populism rather than classifying people or politicians or parties as either populist or non-populist. So rather than defining populism or populists, taking those politicians and studying them and considering that they represent populism, rather study how people do or don't do populism. And this quite naturally leads to kind of extending our point of view from just looking at politicians in parliaments and campaigns, but also looking at how citizens might use populist argumentation or do populist politics in public debates. Social media, or so-called counter media, which have become more and more important in politics recently, that are not usually controlled by political parties per se. Sometimes they are, of course. I've tried to do this in two sets of research thus far. I'm going to present the first one in this presentation. That is using emotional familiarity in the debate over Suvivirsi, which I'll get to next. So in that article, I claim that populists demand that personal feelings, broadly speaking, be accepted as political arguments rather than framing demands by general values. The other article that actually came out yesterday is about contesting experts and contesting expertise in populist counter media, where I kind of look at two differing strategies of doing this, kind of appealing to common sense or creating counter knowledge, which are two very different strategies of contesting experts and contesting expertise. If someone's interested in that one, I can send you a copy. But let's go to the first one, emotional familiarity. So if we look at the literature on populism, some of the most commonly recognized tools, if we think of populism as a political toolkit, of how to go about doing this, how to valorize the people while denigrating the elite. It's often noted that populism appeals to emotions. It's not often specified how or which emotions, but it's said that populism is emotional. And often it's said that populism is a reaction to a crisis, or actually populism creates a sense of crisis. Depends on how you look at it. But in any case, populism often presents itself as an emotionally appealing solution to a crisis of some kind, an alternative to politics as usual. And some of the tools in sociology that we could use to analyze such dynamics, such politics, would be Mabel Berzin's idea of communities of feeling. She defines communities of feeling so that they bring individuals together in a bounded, usually public space for a discrete time period to express emotional energy. And this is something that really resonates when I think about how Suvivirsi is used. I'll go to that soon. And Laurent Thévenot's idea of commonplaces, which was just presented, my interpretation is that they are material or cultural things which facilitate the sharing of deep personal feelings, put in a kind of slightly more general language. And I'm going to argue that the summer hymn is such a commonplace, and the people singing it form a community of feeling, in Berzin's words, which can then be used politically, and is used politically. So what is the summer hymn? Considering the nationalist usage, it's actually ironic that it's a Swedish song, not a Finnish one. But it is perhaps even more popular in Finland these days, because it's quite an old song, at least in the Finnish context. It was popularized in Finland after the Great Famine of 1695 to 1697, which resulted in roughly 1/4 to 1/3 of the Finnish population perishing to hunger after a few brutally cold winters, which resulted in the loss of crops. So it was a terrible, terrible tragedy. And this song, which is a Christian hymn, thanks God for the coming of springtime, when we are going to be enjoying the first harvest that will save us from a certain death in a brutally cold and poor country. And it was included in the church hymn book in 1701, right after the Great Famine. So that's the kind of original social context when it was popularized, which is very, very central to understanding why the coming of summer might be such an important event. It's not just summer, it's the harvest. It's kind of God saving us from hunger, the original meaning. But nowadays it's typically sung by students in schools' end of semester ceremonies in the spring. Of course, those students are not threatened by hunger and cold, but that's kind of the original meaning in any case. And it's quite often said that all Finns know the song by heart, which they kind of do. For example, I've sung it since I was 7 every spring in school. Ceremonies is like the first song they teach you, and then they put the pupils in front, and all the parents come and see you, and they get all emotional and moved that their children are singing the same song as they used to sing when they were kids. But the thing is that it is a Christian hymn, and Finland used to be a fairly kind of culturally homogeneous country and religiously homogeneous country. In 1970, 95% of Finns were church members. But that's now down to 75% and rapidly declining. Not only because of immigration, also because of general secularization. Young people tend to leave church when they turn 18 and they get the permit to get out of church. And young people don't really join the church anymore, of course. And since 2002, this has been a subject of debate each spring, should we be able to sing this song anymore in schools? It's kind of similar to the debates on crucifixes on schools in Italy, for example, or can we say Merry Christmas anymore because we're not all Christians, and so on. And I will briefly show you a video of students in a Finnish school singing the song. This is a high school, I think. They also have a small orchestra, which is not that typical. Well, sometimes they do. But anyway, just a minute of clip of the song from a spring. So that's the first verse. There are, I think, maybe 6. The debate also has to do on which verses you can sing, because some verses explicitly mention Jesus, for example, and others don't. So it's all sometimes argued that we can sing the first 3, but not the 4th one, and so on. So how did I look at this debate? I searched for Suvivirsi in Helsingin Sanomat, which is the largest daily newspaper, and the dominant newspaper in Finland. The Finnish press is quite small. So the mentions of Suvivirsi from 2001 until 2011, roughly 20 times a year, the song is mentioned. The debate really kind of exploded in 2014. There's a lot more mentions that year. So but there's roughly 2 waves. So I took the 2 waves into analysis. The bars in dark gray are what I analyzed. And also to include politicians. I included a survey made to parliamentary candidates in the 2011 elections. There was a survey question of should Suvivirsi be sung in school spring ceremonies. So it was a matter of national political debate. And there were 358 comments from parliamentary candidates on this matter. So I have both opinion pieces in newspapers, editorial pieces in newspapers, and comments from parliamentary candidates on this issue. But not all of my material is actually about the debate on whether it should be sung or not, because just searching for the term kind of shows that there is a significant cultural value to the song, or a cultural use to the song. That very, very often in Helsingin Sanomat, in the newspaper, there's around the end of May, the beginning of June, when the school ceremonies take place, there's kind of a piece of news that Suvivirsi will ring out in Finnish schools to mark the beginning of summer. That's kind of the way of writing the piece about schools. Summer holidays starting is that they will now sing Suvivirsi, and that symbolizes the summer holiday. Or when an ice hockey team lost the tournament, Helsingin Sanomat wrote that the team was seen off to summer holidays by Suvivirsi, so the fans of the opposing team started singing the song when it was obvious that the other team was going to lose and they were going to have to start their summer holidays. And even a story about a medical implant for the hearing impaired, so that the hearing impaired could hear again, is introduced by telling the story of this 2nd grader called Tuulia, who thanks to the implant can now join the others in singing Suvivirsi. She couldn't join them in singing the song, but now she has this implant that she can do this. So it does seem to be quite significant in that sense, in a kind of non-political or pre-political sense. But the debate really kicked off in 2002 when a reader calling herself a grandmother by title writes in the opinion section that she is deeply concerned over the fact that some kindergartens do not sing Suvivirsi each spring because there are a few Muslims amongst the children, she writes. Immediately, almost immediately, in a week, there's an official from the Ministry of Education that writes to dispel the rumors. Suvivirsi will not be silenced. He states that this is just a rumor. It's not based on anything. And actually, in the data from 2002 and 2014, I found no single argument that, yes, we should ban Suvivirsi from officials or, I don't know, Muslim groups or atheist groups. I do know that atheist groups feel that Suvivirsi should be banned, but they weren't let in the papers. And there are 13 reports that it will not be banned. Officials are saying that there's no such ban coming. Nobody's saying that it will be banned. But still there are dozens and dozens of angry letters all the time defending it, such as, I heard that an EU directive forbids singing the 4th verse of Suvivirsi in schools since it mentions Jesus. There's no such EU directive. So the debate has a lot to do with whether Suvivirsi is religion or culture. And this has to do with different justifications and kind of choosing which world of justification we're operating in. It's quite often claimed by the opinion writers that it's part of our cultural heritage. It's culture, it's not religion. It's part of Finnish culture. It's part of our national cultural heritage despite its religious background. So it's argued that it has kind of detached from the religious meaning and it's now purely non-religious, just cultural, just a custom. And a politician might argue in the survey that hasn't Suvivirsi always echoed in Finnish schools at the end of May? It's an essential part of Finnish cultural heritage. Another form of this cultural heritage argument is that this culture is fundamentally incompatible with Islam, or rather actually Islam is incompatible with our culture. An opinion writer wrote that they shouldn't be allowed to change our traditions. The banning of Suvivirsi, the supposedly looming ban of Suvivirsi, was said to be a continuation of insulting the values of the majority, trampling on women's rights, silent acceptance of genital mutilation and honor violence. So all the horrors associated with Islam. And the Finnish party politician argued that if our tradition is offensive to someone, they should move to a country whose traditions don't offend them. I understand immigrants have come here to get help. Why are they trying to take over the country? So these are kind of different forms of cultural or religious justification. So they try to argue why culture is important. They claim that others will argue with the importance of cultural traditions, agree with the importance of cultural traditions, and of course I also kind of feel that I would be partly saddened if it would be banned from schools, let's say, but that's another thing. One significant portion of the arguments don't actually try, in my opinion, to base themselves in any kind of general shared set of abstract values, kind of try to argue it in that way, because quite often people just claim that the experience is what matters, the feelings are what matters. It's a part of the shared experience of many generations. It arouses feelings of nostalgia. Even the Deputy Chancellor of Justice kind of agreed that the song contains a powerful emotional charge. And people often reference these physically felt emotions. A news piece said that Suvivirsi moves you, it makes you weep, it causes shivers, and it makes your heart pound. These are quotes from different articles. A right-wing, sort of moderate right-wing politician said that it still brings tears to my eyes when I sing it. this I want to be continued, and this feeling I hope will be passed to children. Or simply just, it feels familiar. A social democrat politician simply wrote this as an argument. It feels familiar, that's why it should be maintained. And when this feeling of familiarity is insulted, it seems, it creates these strong emotional responses, even though I've looked at written texts in a newspaper and in a survey made to political candidates that are kind of should be rather perhaps detached from personal everyday experience. I mean, I haven't interviewed these politicians myself in a personal setting or anything like that. These are written arguments and mediated arguments. A Finnish party politicians wrote in the survey that if Finns have to look at the religious dress of Muslims and the subordination of women under the guise of religion, so we can without worry sing Suvivirsi once a year. And with caps lock, is this question some sort of joke? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Another one wrote that totally unbelievable that someone would even question this. Just give me a break, several exclamation marks, or just that's it. And politicians just gives up here. They don't write any sort of justification. They just, okay, that's it. And two candidates just wrote down the first few songs, the first few verses of the song, as if they were kind of singing it behind their keyboards as they were writing the answers. That was their only argument, is just to kind of write down the lyrics that they don't have to appeal to any generalized values. I tried to also classify these arguments and sort of quantify perhaps differences between parties in these ways of presenting these arguments. And this is directly adapted from Laurent's work. I tried to operationalize familiarity and justification in this article by looking at whether they reference implicitly or explicitly common value systems such as cultural or religious heritage, or do they reference the concrete experience of singing the hymn, being in a place, and the emotions that evokes. And just doing a brief comparison of parties in the 2011 survey, it would seem that the True Finns party especially often appeal to familiarity in the sense of emotion, place, feeling, being there, rather than appealing to the value, the generalized value of culture, for example. So, what I think this kind of tells us perhaps is that, or at least one way of looking at it, is that using the emotional familiarity of Suvivirsi in a political debate can be considered as a demand that familiarity be accepted as a justification. Since there's politicians and people arguing in the public, but not basing their arguments in any general value system, they're simply saying how they feel, describing the event, describing the place, and that should be enough. They're talking in a very particular personal emotional sense rather than translating those worries into official language or generalized value systems. And this helps them side with the common people, or at least an idealized notion of the common people who don't have to don't have to use this abstract language of principles of justice like politicians are claimed to do. They just know what is right. The chairman of the Finns party, Timo Soini, actually the ex-chairman of the Finns party, often said that the people know, kyllä kansa tietää. They just know. They don't have to be told. They just know what is right, both morally and kind of in terms of knowledge. And of course, it's also a nostalgic argument that we didn't have to debate this before. They're kind of looking back to a heartland, to to a past where these issues did not have to be debated and argued and justified. We could just sing the song as we feel is right. So looking at this from Berezin's idea of the communities of feeling, she writes that political identities are distant from the concerns of ordinary life. One could argue that perhaps not so, but anyway, political identities are public identities. They frequently take second place to more deeply felt private identities. So from this perspective, I would argue that this gap between deeply felt private identity and political identity is what populism often tries to bridge. And at least these appeals to commonplaces try to bridge. And commonplaces can act as such bridges. So the populists are saying that your personal identity is your political identity. You don't have to transform your arguments in any official language. You don't have to think about ideological affiliations. We should go by your gut feeling. And the community of feeling, those brought together by this familiar experience that is not nationalist in the first place. Suvivirsi has, it doesn't really have a nationalist message. It's not about the Finnish nation. But the community, it's a Swedish song actually, it's a Swedish song. It's not about the Finnish nation, but it's made to be, the experience is made to be about a nationalist political identity. So familiarity in this way seems to be quite an effective tool of populism to say that our politics is not about politicians and bureaucrats, it's ordinary, simple, comfortable, everyday life. That's what it's about. It's a way to kind of bring feelings to the arena in a way that is somehow resonant. And it can be used to bridge the gap between personal feelings and political identities. This, of course, may broaden the gamut of acceptable claims in politics. That is kind of often claimed that populism does give a voice to some people who didn't have a voice in politics before. That's not necessarily always what we would want. I say we very broadly, but because such claims, if they're made to these familiarities, to these commonplaces, they can be strongly exclusionary because you can't really understand the argument about Suvivirsi if you haven't felt the experience. That's at least what is implied by those arguments, that we, as a community of feeling, will sing this song because we know that it is right. It's kind of difficult to argue with that, or difficult to enter that community of feeling if you haven't grown up in that culture, if you haven't participated in that ritual each and every spring. Thank you.
Okay, we'll begin with some questions. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. This was very interesting. I have a short question about beauty. Do you suppose that this experience have to be based on something perceived as beautiful? Can the feeling of familiarity of something disgusting also be unifying and connecting people?
That's a good question, which I haven't really looked into, but I think it can. For example, if we think of the example of coal mines and the kind of feelings of resentment that for example, Trump taps into, and of course, this is kind of perhaps a positive or a unifying or a beautiful feeling that they tap into, but that's a very good point, that it's maybe even more often studied or looked at how kind of populist politicians tap into negative moments of resentment or hatred and so on. Surely it has different dynamics, but something similar, I guess, would be happening with negative feelings as well.
You'll take Matthias, yeah.
Well, I guess you could take the references to Islam as a unifying negative, which immediately arises out of the positive value attached to the song. But my question would be different. Simple point of detail. When you classified the responses as to whether they refer to general value systems as justification or to familiarity as justification, no, your numbers with the parties. I was just wondering, how did you classify the response of the two politicians who merely quoted the lyrics?
Doing classifications such as these, and especially trying to quantify content analysis in this way, is of course a matter of interpretation, and it's somewhat ambiguous a lot of times. I would classify the quotes of the lyrics in the familiarity category, because I would think that kind of reference is singing the song. That's about singing the song. It's not about the value of the song, because the point of writing those lyrics down is not the contents of the lyrics. I mean, the first verses are "Jo joutui armas aika," which means something like finally this blessed time is upon us, or something like that. And they don't think what it means. It's just, we know this song. It's about familiarity.
The gentleman here.
I would like to know if it's more the song itself, the hymn. It sounds like the hymn, an ecclesiastical hymn, which provokes familiarity, or also the text. You didn't say anything about the text.
I feel that the text is not that relevant in this case, because I would say that the people participating in singing the hymn or talking about the hymn, they don't really talk about the content, almost ever. It doesn't really matter to them. What matters is that it is familiar, it has been done for decades and decades, and we should continue it. I have a translation of the lyrics in the actual article, but it's my kind of part of my main argument is that they don't care about the content. The text does not matter for them.
I think Misha in the front.
So I'm wondering about possible non-populist extensions and ways of making Suvivirsi compatible with something other than just Finnish emotion. One possibility obviously would be to kind of stress the Swedish aspect and to say, well, you know, I mean, not to mention the fact that the Finnish nation, of course, can be argued to have been kind of co-created by the Swedes and the Russians. But, you know, this is kind of a possible Scandinavian extension, or, you know, the whole debate about the Swedish-speaking community in Finland, etc. Another one, I mean, speaking as someone with the dark secret of an Estonian family connection, I don't think there is an Estonian version. Actually, I'm pretty sure there isn't. But of course, Estonia is a nation that kind of prides itself on creating itself through song, right? So there could be a possible kind of, you know, Finnish-Estonian thing going on, saying, you know, we are the kind of, you know, Ugro-Finnic singing nations. But then also going beyond that, I mean, strangely enough, many of the most devoutly Muslim refugees from Crimea inside Ukraine, as I learned recently, settle in Lviv, in Lvov, Lemberg, Lviv, in western Ukraine. And the justification they usually give is that, well, here people are religious. So, you know, they may be Catholic or, you know, Greek Catholic, etc., but they understand us. So it's easier for us. Actually, the quotes given in that paper were all about, we don't have to explain everything, as we would with the atheists, so we feel comfortable here. So, you know, one could imagine, I mean, not necessarily with Muslim immigrants, but for people who would be classified as aliens by the true Finns, but who would find, you know, an entryway into this by saying, well, you know, we have something similar, we can relate. So, is there anything like that in this case?
Thank you. There was an attempt to kind of make Suvivirsi neutral again. There was a popular musician, a singer, and a writer who wrote new lyrics, sort of loosely based on the hymn lyrics, with the same melody, that were non-religious, that were kind of, I think it was called Suvilaulu or something similar, so the summer song, not the summer hymn, kind of removing the religious aspect and thus trying to make it more universal, more appealing, to kind of transcend the debate on whether, because the religious content is also what's at debate here, because it's claimed that they want to ban Suvivirsi, and they of course means Muslims, but also officials, neither of which are concretely trying to ban Suvivirsi, but anyway. The claim is that they're doing it because it's religious and we can't hold on to our religious traditions anymore. So by creating a non-religious version of it with kind of a broad as possible popular appeal, there was an attempt to kind of reclaim the song, but it didn't really take off, possibly because the most traditional advocates, or the people who most strongly want to hold on to Suvivirsi, probably don't really want to accept a modified version of it, because it would seem like giving up, in a sense. Since the people strongly defending Suvivirsi feel so kind of threatened and entrenched in their position, it's really kind of probably difficult to kind of mediate that in a way. There was even this, I could have shown a video of that as well, an event called Save the Suvivirsi, and the event name was in English, it was Save the Suvivirsi, where this male choir gathered on the balconies of an apartment building next to a square in Helsinki to sing the song, and people were invited to join to sing the song, and there were, I think, 2,000 people came up to sing the song as it has always been sung. So, and that kind of, it's not just the right-wing populists taking this on. The sentiment to save Suvivirsi enjoys very, very broad appeal, even among the sort of less radically culturally nativist people. So that kind of also makes it difficult to try and play up the Swedish connection, or maybe the Estonian connection. As to the question about Muslim immigrants and the Ukraine.
Some questions with a comparison.
Yeah. It is, I mean, it's, I think that there would be quite many Muslim immigrants in Finland that would feel that definitely Suvivirsi should be sung in Finnish schools. Our children just maybe won't sing it, but it's fine that they're in the same celebration. And as I said, I didn't find really any Muslim advocacy groups or anything wanting to ban the song. So I don't think the sentiment or the threat is real. At least I can't find really any evidence of that.
The gentleman here.
I have a question about your 3 waves of populism and what it means for your interpretation of the example you presented to us. Now, from a German perspective, it's quite striking that you left out the fascist populism of the 1930s and the reaction to this populism in the post-war period. So there's basically the repression of that populism was the unifying understanding in the post-war world that this kind of populism has to be replaced with what Laurent was talking about, this liberal understanding of politics. Now, is the new populism you were talking about, which of course in the Finnish context with the party from the 1950s you were telling us about, is this new wave of populism that is gaining in Finland a sign of this post-war consensus to repress the fascist populism, to call that, a sign that this post-war consensus is waning, is weakening, and is no longer holding back fascist populism. And there's another dimension to this, which I sort of missed in your presentation, which is indirectly, of course, what we just talked about when Misha was asking, the migration problem, but is more generally known as the globalization and the reaction to globalization. Is this something that can be used as an interpretive frame here as well? So is this what you were telling us about, a reaction to globalization and its negative consequences? And is this a frame you could use to explain what is going on?
Yeah, the reason why I don't go into fascism here is that in terms of research is kind of a totally different field. When we look at the waves of populism, perhaps you are right, perhaps it should be included, but it has to be said that the fascist movements around the Second World War were very, very different, and the kind of, perhaps I didn't include it because I don't want to get into the discussion of similarities and continuities between new right-wing populism. Well, it's a whole different discussion that I'm kind of not that well read in. I mean, there are researchers looking into that, and it's just not my field. But of course, it is. If you look at this slide, it is kind of striking. Whereas, kind of, is it a reaction to globalization? The new, for example, Finnish right-wing populism, definitely it is. Globalization is portrayed as one of the generalized threats trying to take away our simple way of life, or maybe simple is not the wrong word, but the way of life that doesn't have to be justified. Globalization is kind of one of the forces that are said to threaten that simplicity and that those commonplaces, and make us, force us to formulate these positions in the way of justifications and looking at it through generalized value systems and so on. So sometimes, well, globalization is just not the term that of course the actors themselves use. They often talk about Islam most often.
Laurent in the front
here. I was struck by your too short comment about, well, it's not just a short comment, it's very important in your both methodology and focus of analysis, the move from the experiencing together of the commonplace, which is exactly what I try to analyze, and the debate. And I think it's very important to be careful about all the needed transformation, because the commonplace is certainly not the format of argument at all. But obviously, what you show of the statements from the press is precisely this transformation, change of format. And so I would really like to hear more. Is it in your PhD, this segment, this transformation? Because it's really something to look at very closely. Why? Because it's one of our main political issues. What do we do of religion, faith, very strong attachment in the public space? And because the format, and again it goes back to what I just hinted at in my talk about all this movement of acting around taking care of commonplace, all the problem of their transformation or transition in something political, not necessarily evil and populist, but even possibly democratic. I think there are always transformation to look at carefully, because this is a point of tension. So what would you say about your elements of your observations of this change of format? You just mentioned the fact that you need to have the experience, but at the same time, people argue about this experience. And I was thinking, you know, of course, the paper by Gachos and Narapashova, you remember they were part of the workshop, and they will be in the issue of European Journal of Cultural and Political Sociology. And they were looking at that very carefully, only through TV debate about referendum on involving religion in Slovakia. And they were constantly documenting this move in terms of even game by actors from something that is not prepared for publicity, although it's commonality, but not prepared for public space detachment, but they use it in a public space. So I think this is something very important nowadays, and we need to have precise tools and precise analysis. What would you say in addition to your short sentence?
Yes, thank you. The big issue here with this paper is studying commonplaces through media material is rather different, or rather difficult, because it is, as I said, quite mediated material with particular conventions of expression that is somewhat distant or maybe non-conducive to communication via commonplaces. So the material itself is somewhat detached from the actual experience. So what if we would look at more closely about the transition or the transformation from the commonplace to the argument in the public, which I agree should definitely be done, I think it would require a more kind of rigorous, perhaps ethnographic approach to the ritual or the experience itself, the actual event and the place, the happening of singing a song, which is something that is not present in at least this version of the paper, looking at it through media material. So I say a little bit more, I guess, about the transformation between the commonplace and the argument in the public in the PhD, but not very much. I kind of have, in this paper, I am focusing on actually more on argumentation in the public than the commonplace, but what I'm trying to explain is that the arguments would not have the weight or the resonance if it were not for the commonplace and the experience, and that's why it's so important. But the transition phase could be looked at much more closely, I agree.
We have time for one more quick question, I think, in the back there.
Yeah, also thank you very much for your presentation. I have two quick questions. So the first one is a rather theoretical question. Because in the beginning you showed us this overview over the populism literature, and my question would be where you would place this new perspective by Jan Werner Müller, because I'm asking this myself, and I think his perspective became too important to be ignored. And the second question is regarding this specific song that you introduced to us. So, I mean, the True Finns is really a populist party. I think there's no doubt about that. But it's a nationalist populist party. And when I saw this debate, how you presented it to us, I was wondering, is it maybe more linked? Is it linked to populism, or is it maybe more linked to the nationalist aspects of the True Finns, to this party, or to nationalism in general? Because this debate seems to be, to me, more framed in a nationalist or specifically in a nativist way, and not so much in a populist way.
Thank you. In the ideology position, and I'm partly criticizing him when I'm criticizing the ideological view. A lot of white literature and populist, perhaps, for example, sociologists, but also political scientists from the kind of practice-oriented view. For example, Jansen, Moffitt, Grubeck, I myself, but influential. About nationalism, or it is about both. I try to look at, I do sometimes, I'm accused of kind of forgetting nationalist practices when I do that by focusing on populism. Be the obvious way of interpreting the debate. It is about nationalism. I have been told that that's not about populism, it's about nationalism, and I kind of a lot about that. But this, I think, not new. You can also see populist practices taking place that has a lot to do with nationalism, or that is nationalism. For the purposes of this, where the focus on commonplaces and sites and places, those parties and arguments present themselves with the common people. Of course, I do that, and you do that, arguments on that. But the populist can also work through that. Obviously, it's a nationalist debate as well, but populism and